Oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Confusion seems to be growing every day about what the Premier's cap-and-trade scheme actually entails. Will it help the environment? We don't know. Will any polluter have to pay? Nobody knows. Will we all have to pay more? There is no answer, Mr. Speaker. No one seems to know. But it's time to get some answers. So I would like to start with the issue of electricity pricing. Mr. Speaker, can the Premier confirm that Nova Scotia Power is an emitter and subject to the new carbon pricing rules?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Again, I want to thank all those Nova Scotians who, for the last decade, have continued to ensure that GHG reduction in this province leads the country, Mr. Speaker. Through some very tough regulations, we'll continue to reduce and lead the country, Mr. Speaker. And I want to let the honourable member know if he looks at the cap-and-trade system in this province, the credits that are in this province belong to all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, and those Nova Scotians will be able to use those to smooth them across, so we make sure we protect the pocketbooks of all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Well, I don't know if you heard a yes or no there, Mr. Speaker, but we certainly didn't. Nova Scotians deserve straight answers to these questions. They already pay the highest power rates in the country. The Premier is congratulating them for doing that work appropriately because it's because of those power rates that Nova Scotia is in the better position that it is in the environment today. And yet they deserve to know if they're going to be asked to pay even more, Mr. Speaker, in straight, plain language. So I'd like to ask the Premier if he can confirm that if Nova Scotia Power exceeds its caps under the cap-and-trade system, will those credits have to be purchased by the power company to stay in line with his new rules?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to thank all those Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, who continue to work with our government to continue to improve the economy across the province. As the honourable member would know, the federal government, the bureaucracy in the federal government announced last week we were the only one of two Canadian provinces on a path to sustainability, Mr. Speaker. That's because of the hard work of so many Nova Scotians, and I want to continue to ensure the honourable member that we'll continue to make sure that this province is affordable. As he would know, he ran not the last election, the one before, talking about all kinds of things around power dates, saying we couldn't do what we actually promised Nova Scotians. Well, actual fact, Mr. Speaker, we've delivered, and we'll deliver on this program, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
No, Mr. Speaker, they did not deliver. What the Premier told Nova Scotians is he would break the monopoly, that there would be competition for power, that there would be multiple power companies for them to purchase their electricity from, Mr. Speaker. But every Nova Scotian today still has only one choice. He broke his promise to the people of Nova Scotia on power, Mr. Speaker. And you know what? They are also very aware that that power company, unlike other companies, passes all its costs onto its customers. It continues to live under the cost of service delivery model, something the Premier promised to change and did not, Mr. Speaker. So they deserve to know, Nova Scotians do, a straight-up answer. Will Nova Scotia Power be able to pass on its carbon prices to its ratepayers under his plan, yes or no?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As he would know, Mr. Speaker, renewable energy producers can sell in this province, Mr. Speaker, very much we committed to in 2030. The honourable member would also know, Mr. Speaker, that under his party and under the NDP, power rates were increasing around 30% through their term, Mr. Speaker. Under this government, Mr. Speaker, power rates have gone down. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to operate and work with Nova Scotia. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, we're going to make sure that this province is affordable, and at the same time we're protecting the environment.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. My question today, Mr. Speaker, marks the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. Today, Nova Scotia has the highest poverty rate in Atlantic Canada. We have the worst child poverty in all of Canada, and we have the fastest rising food bank use of any province in our country. Mr. Speaker, does the Premier of Nova Scotia acknowledge that these are facts?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, he would know in the most recent budget, 60,000 Nova Scotians will no longer pay income tax, Mr. Speaker. He would also know that there was a change to the HARP program, that we will see 5,000 more Nova Scotia families have access to support when they go to heat, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, he would also know that the Minister of Education in this government has introduced a pre-primary program, Mr. Speaker, that currently only 1 in 4 children are being available to, Mr. Speaker. He would know there's a direct socioeconomic reason for that. Our program will give 100% coverage for all 4-year-olds in this province, give them a better chance. Mr. Speaker, continue to support those families.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on his first supplementary.
Thank you. Members of this government have offered the view on various occasions that the problem of poverty eradication is so enormously complex that solving it is more difficult and intricate than anyone could hardly imagine. But there is a vast research literature on this subject that says that what is required to end poverty is really very simple. 1, affordable childcare. 2, a $15 minimum wage. 3, social assistance rates high enough so that people can buy their groceries. And 4, rent control so that everyone can afford a roof. Mr. Speaker, is there one of these 4 measures that the Premier will commit to?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I'm very proud, Mr. Speaker. In our first term, we had the largest single increase in income assistance in the history of this province, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that followed after 4 years when he had an opportunity to make an impact for low-income Nova Scotians. It did, Mr. Speaker. I also want to remind the Honourable Member that housing rates, those waiting for, Mr. Speaker, affordable housing rates in this province have dropped 20% under our first term. We're committed to continue to increase, Mr. Speaker, to working with organizations on rent subs. So we're going to continue, Mr. Speaker, to make meaningful change for low-income Nova Scotians. I would encourage the Honourable Member, actually, sorry, Mr. Speaker, he did vote for the budget, so I don't want to be too critical of that.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier should show greater respect for the people whose difficulties and sufferings that we're speaking about than to tie up the time of the House with his reflections about a government that was elected almost 10 years ago. Since this government took office, which is the subject that is before us, we have 7,500 more people in Nova Scotia being fed from food banks, and 2,500 of them are children. Will the Premier acknowledge the downward spiral Nova Scotia has been in on poverty these last 4 years, and does he take responsibility to do something about it in this second term?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, again, I want to thank the Honourable Member for giving me an opportunity to continue to remind him the single largest increase in income assistance happened under this government, Mr. Speaker. I want to tell him that, Mr. Speaker. I also want to tell him, while people were languishing on wait lists for affordable housing, Mr. Speaker, when they were in government, Mr. Speaker, we've reduced that by 20%, and we're continuing going to, Mr. Speaker, reduce it even further. We're going to continue to work, Mr. Speaker, with the tax system so that when we make adjustments in the tax system, the working poor in this province are going to get the largest single decrease in their taxes, Mr. Speaker, in the history of this province. 60,000 Nova Scotians will actually be taken off the tax roll, which means we'll be leaving more money in the pockets of those families. And I want to encourage the Honourable Member, when he had a chance to be in government, to do something for Nova Scotians. Those very children he spoke about, Mr. Speaker, that he ignored for 4 years while he was in government, Mr. Speaker, the pre-primary program will give those kids hope for the future.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, for almost 2 years now, Nova Scotia has been without new cyberbullying legislation to protect the victims of this horrible crime, including our own children. It's now time, Mr. Speaker, for this House to put new legal protections in place for the victims of cyberbullying. The current plan that the government has brought forth may not be perfect, but quite simply doing nothing is not an option. So I'd like to ask the Premier if he will commit to passing new cyberbullying legislation during this session of the Legislature.
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question, and I want to congratulate the Minister for the introduction of his piece of legislation. Continue to work. Mr. Speaker, we'll continue to work through the process, as all pieces of legislation do in this House. And Mr. Speaker, we'll make sure that we hear from all Nova Scotians and all stakeholders when it comes to making sure this piece of legislation is in place. And we're very proud of the hard work they did. Mr. Speaker, like we did on a number of other occasions, we'll make sure that if there's people out there who want to come in to hear, to speak to this bill, then we'll make sure that happens.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, we find ourselves in the odd position of asking the government to pass its own bill. That's how important this issue is. Fact of the matter is, there is time in this session in committee to hear from more Nova Scotians about cyberbullying. And I would like to encourage the government to make sure that that happens later this week. There's also time, Mr. Speaker, to tweak some of the things that have come forward, like the powers of the cyber scan unit, which we are in favour of making those changes in this session, Mr. Speaker. I want the Premier to reconsider his position to leave that plan unpassed this session and tell the House that he will allow MLAs to vote to enact a new cyberbullying law before this session concludes.
The Honourable Premier.
Again, I want to thank the Honourable for the questions. He knows, as I've said to him many times, we'll continue to let the bill move through the process. We'll ensure that we hear from all Nova Scotians and every MLA will get an opportunity to vote at the piece of legislation at some point in the future.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Community Services. Chantal Kaiser is a single mother who saw her rent increase by $40 a month this year. With each rent increase, she, like many others, has to make choices about buying food or maintaining housing for herself and her child. Mr. Speaker, rents in Halifax have increased more than 10% since last year alone, and yet the government has made no increases to the shelter allowance for those receiving income assistance. Mr. Speaker, will the minister admit that the current shelter rates are completely inadequate and agree to an immediate increase?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for her question. I would note that under this government we have increased our investments in affordable housing. In fact, we've increased the number of rent supplements this year alone, Mr. Speaker. We've seen the wait lists come down and we're committed to continue that work. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, it's not just income assistance clients who are being priced out of appropriate housing. Most adults living in poverty are employed. We have the lowest minimum wage in the country, and 32% of workers in Nova Scotia are earning $15 an hour or less. Yet Halifax is one of the top 10 most expensive rental markets in Canada. Mr. Speaker, what is the minister doing to ensure low and moderate income people have access to quality, affordable rental housing?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As I indicated earlier, we are increasing the number of rent supplements, Mr. Speaker, and we've uncoupled the deferred federal contribution so that we can make investments in housing across this province, unlike what they did. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, a family in my constituency is currently facing a challenge many Nova Scotians know all too well. About 8 months ago, their family doctor retired. They were fortunate to have found a new physician and paid to have their records transferred. That doctor has recently announced he is leaving the province. He's leaving because he was not permitted privileges at the nearby ER and wanted to split his time between the hospital and his practice. This doctor was Canadian-born, Canadian-trained, and ended up moving back to his home province. My question, Mr. Speaker, for the minister is, why is this government making it so difficult for doctors who want to work in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. As the member would know, the work that goes on in the province to attract and retain the physicians and the other primary care providers from one end to the province to the next is ongoing, Mr. Speaker. I have to recognize, Mr. Speaker, the work that needs to be done in certain communities may vary, Mr. Speaker, so that the work that gets done when the NSHA is identifying where they need those resources allocated and the focus there, Mr. Speaker. That's done with an eye to ensuring that we provide the best services we can to Nova Scotians for the primary care and emergency care. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
I'd like to thank the Minister for that answer, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the province did not have to lose his doctor, but the health authority denied privileges for him to work in one of our emergency rooms here in the province. The family has had to spend hundreds of dollars twice in 1 year to get their medical records. And two of the individuals have serious medical conditions that require regular blood work and exams. They've now lost consistency in receiving their health care. My question for this minister is, will the minister commit to finding a solution for families like this one so they are not constantly shopping around for doctors when they need to have serious illnesses that need immediate attention and have to pay each time the records are moved?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. It's an opportunity to let the member know that indeed that's something that is on our radar as well to address, Mr. Speaker. One of the ways to address these concerns around records are medical records, Mr. Speaker, and it also supports the opportunity to have collaborative teams come together providing the services, Mr. Speaker, is through the use of technology, Mr. Speaker, and that would be work that's ongoing to identify and implement a one patient, one record. That would be an electronic health record that's available to the service providers. That could help, Mr. Speaker, address this concern around the information and the personal medical records. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Business. In February of 2016, this government quietly engaged Fred Morley to lead a study analyzing the place of sharing economy companies like Airbnb and Uber in the Nova Scotia economy. The province said at the time the report would take up to 1 year to complete. That's come and gone. I just wondering if the minister can give an update to this House as to when they can expect to see Mr. Morley's report.
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. I don't have an updated timeline on that. I'm assuming it's coming relatively quickly, but I'll certainly check with our folks back at the Department of Business and get back to the House tomorrow. Thanks.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the minister for that answer. He might be able to check on a few other reports that are past due too at the time, but this is an important report. This is a report that's going to look at the uneven playing field, according to the then Minister of Business, going to look at the uneven playing field between traditional businesses and those that operate more informally. The report's going to look at the revenue that the province may be losing, i.e. some additional taxes, Mr. Speaker. But this is a report that's going to look at lots of things, and Nova Scotians are anxious to have a look at this report. So I wonder if the minister can give this House a little sneak preview today. Will this report give us a glimpse into how this government looks at Uber and Airbnb operating this province?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. It certainly is a challenging one in some regards and an opportunity in another. On one hand, speaking to Michelle Sarin and the folks at Tourism Nova Scotia, there's a tremendous amount of new business, new potential with respect to Airbnb, Uber, and how it fits into our tourism complement here in the province. On the other hand, we're certainly concerned about some of the issues that Tyans, the members of the Tourism Industry Association of Nova Scotia, are raising, because obviously it could jeopardize their business model and impact on their revenues, and of course they're tax-paying citizens, and they provide local work and employment to Nova Scotians and drum up the tourism sector, which, as everyone knows, we're going to double by 2024. So it is a two-way street, and we'll get back to the member. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of TIR. Mr. Speaker, recently we've had a failure in some infrastructure in our community. It's known as the Myra Gut Bridge. It's between the communities of Manitou and Port Morion and a major transportation link. The bridge itself is about 124 years old, and it has finally failed. My question to the minister is, could he provide the House and the members of the community an update as to what his department's plans are for that piece of infrastructure?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question. Yes, indeed, it's a three-span former railway bridge, and we're close on the age. Our numbers are saying parts of it could be as old as 140 years old. First of all, Mr. Speaker, I want to say how grateful I am to our department staff when August 10th made the decision to close that bridge because of safety reasons, and a difficult decision because we know how important it is to the people of the community. But as we saw on the weekend with an additional failure, that was the right decision to be made in the interests of safety, and an in-depth engineering study is currently underway.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the minister for that reply. I guess what I understand is that this is a project that could take a fair amount of time to find a solution to, and again, I appreciate that, but the community is concerned about the amount of time it might take for emergency vehicles to make responses. And of course, the detour that has been caused by this is almost 20 kilometers long, and I was wondering if the minister in the consultation process would look at upgrades to the roads that are making up the detour area, because again, it's a 20-kilometer detour, and that's quite a large detour, and they don't even have to go on the New Boston Road.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question. I'd like to say that we have actually instituted an emergency procurement to take the old structure down, and once we take the old structure down, which is currently an impediment to marine traffic. We know the traffic is important to the fishermen in the area. We're hoping to get that completed very quickly. Then we'll solve that particular problem. We'll look at the analysis of the replacement, and in the meantime, I'll speak to department staff about the condition of the detour roads, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Valley View Villa is a non-profit long-term care facility with 112 beds. Between 2015 and 2016, this government cut more than $8 million from nursing homes across this province. About 40,000 of that funding was cut from Valley View Villa. Mr. Speaker, is the minister satisfied to balance this budget by taking funds from non-profit nursing homes?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity for the question from the member. The work that we've done, Mr. Speaker, in this budget that we just passed on Friday, the member would know sees increased investments in our nursing homes, Mr. Speaker. These investments, Mr. Speaker, are targeted investments for nursing home residents.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health has the floor.
These are targeted investments, Mr. Speaker, based upon feedback that we'd heard from the community, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that food budgets are secured, Mr. Speaker. So that's where a significant amount of the investment, as well as recreation services for the residents. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I, however, think it's disgraceful to talk about a food budget when we're talking about seniors' long-term care facilities. However, you'll have to excuse me if I don't feel like applauding a government that cut money from vulnerable seniors and then wants to get credit for only putting half of it back in. The main budget item for nursing homes is the salaries of the hard-working people who care for the residents of the home. Valley View Villa has told the department they are operating at a deficit, and the department's response has been to ask the facility to try to reduce staffing cuts. Mr. Speaker, does the minister think it is reasonable for this government to hold back money from nursing homes when he knows it is negatively affecting staffing levels for our valuable and vulnerable seniors?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the member opposite would be aware, if she looked into the situation, that there's multiple facets to the Valley View Villa and the services that they provide, Mr. Speaker. The member might recognize that the challenges there that have been recently reported in the media around the financial situation is not something explicitly looked at in the nursing long-term care side, Mr. Speaker, but there are additional services and supports outside of the public system. Mr. Speaker, for services being provided that go above and beyond the services covered by the provincial government. It's a combination of factors there, Mr. Speaker. What I do know is that the unions and the employers are working together, Mr. Speaker. Know that the department, let them know that the department's here to work with them as they go through this process. But always the care of our seniors and population long-term care is a priority. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, many organizations and businesses across Nova Scotia require security checks when adults are working with youth through coaching, fostering, hosting students, youth groups, and for numerous other reasons. It's important that these checks are done and imperative to keep our children safe. Nova Scotians see criminal record and vulnerable sector checks to be completed through the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and can receive those sometimes the same day or waiting a week if fingerprint verification is required. The Child Abuse Registry in Nova Scotia, through the Department of Community Services, can take weeks and sometimes months for the individual to receive clearance to work with youth, sometimes causing the opportunity to coach, advise youth, or host pass them by.
Does the member have a question?
Is the minister aware of the time frame and backlog for processing these applications, and what actions will her department take to expedite the process of clearing Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question, and in fact, I do believe there has been additional staff added to that particular unit so that those can move through quicker. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, the RCMP completes the vulnerable sector check of Nova Scotians who apply, and again, Community Services does the child abuse registry check. I would like to ask the Minister, and thank you for your response for saying that more people have been added. I would like to know, would your department be prepared to work more closely with the RCMP to streamline the process and permit these adults to get their checks a little bit more expediently?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question, and I do want to assure her that we take this matter very seriously, and it's not something I would want anything to be rushed. So expeditious, yes. Rush, no. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Business. Cape Breton Island has a marketing levy. Halifax Regional Municipality has a levy. Yarmouth Marketing and Promotions has a levy. Destination, Eastern and Northumberland Shores, no levy. I've stood in this House now for 4 years asking the same question over and over. When will this government endorse a levy for Deans?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. That's certainly not something that the Department of Business would decide unilaterally. I know that there's a long discussion in Cape Breton before the levy was implemented. It included all stakeholders, tourism operators, tie-ins were involved, Destination Cape Breton, and all tourism operators had their ability to say. Obviously, there's mixed feelings on that. If there's some way that there's a collective effort in the members' areas to move to a levy, then obviously we could be part of that discussion. But from my understanding, obviously the push has to come from municipal units, and it has to be a mandate for them. And of course, we'd be willing to enter into that conversation as well. Thanks.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the Minister's answers. There has been a push. In fact, in 2014, I'll quote the previous Minister said that there is a province-wide strategy being worked on. So I'll table that. However, we have learned that there is no advantage. No one, tie-ins doesn't want to have a province-wide levy. So this is why we have to go with individual municipalities. So I will ask today if the Minister would please come to Pictou and sit with the Director, Cindy McKinnon, and ensure that Deans will be prepared to put a marketing levy in place for next year, so we will not be disadvantaged like the rest of the province is advantaged over us with the levy.
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Mr. Speaker, I'm always happy and very welcome when I come to Pictou. Mr. Speaker, it is a serious question. I think that, look, I can recall, and I know the members opposite that are Cape Breton MLAs can recall this, there was certainly a fair bit of reluctance for the original levy that was implemented in Cape Breton, and when now you look at the fruits of the benefit that have been borne by that decision, it's a collective compilation of money that really adds to the marketing complement. We're lucky to have it in Cape Breton. I know other places obviously benefit from that, and I think that I don't know if they should be in any of those levies should have been or should be in the future imposed if they're not fully accepted by the people who are going to be paying those levies and responsible for collecting them. So I would certainly be more than happy to have the conversation, and anything we can do as a province to facilitate, we would be delighted to do so. Thanks.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question for the Minister of Health. Residents, families of residents, staff are all worried about changes to staffing levels and services at Valley View Villa and the adjoining Havenbrook Manor. The Minister referenced some targeted investments that are being made, and the Minister also indicated, I don't want to read too much into his words, but he said there's other services that are provided. Perhaps the Minister was implying that too many services were being provided to the residents of these facilities. But I'd like to ask the Minister if he can share with this House the reasons behind the changes, the reasons necessitating the changes to the staffing levels at Valley View Villa and Havenbrook Manor.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member would know, the operation is a third party, Mr. Speaker. I think if he was to review the FOIPOP legislation, he'd be aware that I wouldn't be in a position to disclose the details of a particular operation's financial situation in any level of detail without violating aspects of that information that they would have, Mr. Speaker. But indeed, there's been some public information about this organization and some staffing restructuring that they're working on, Mr. Speaker. To my understanding, I've had some conversations with some union leadership on this as well, Mr. Speaker, and again, they've assured me that they are working and have been working with the administration of this organization to work through this process. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Mr. Speaker, the residents and their families are worried, and quite frankly, I'm worried too, because when you have changes to staffing, you have the impact, the possible impact, if nothing else, the impact to services. So we all should be worried about that. And I heard the minister say earlier that he's always client care is of paramount concern to the minister, as I'm sure it is to the members of his department. So I'd like to ask the minister what is being done to make sure that the quality of care, that the access to services like a bath a week, that the meals are not being impacted by the cuts to the staffing levels.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
And thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, there is a licensing process for our long-term care facilities that are licensed by the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. There are criteria and rules that must be adhered to by operators that are licensed facilities, Mr. Speaker. Of course, the staff within the Department of Continuing Care would continue to monitor and assess to make sure that there is adherence to those regulations and the rules governing the licensing of the facility, Mr. Speaker, and we'll continue to move forward and ensure that that is for not just the case of Valley View, but all long-term facilities across the province. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, my question through you is for the Minister of Justice. As we all know, the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia struck down the Incompetent Persons Act in June of 2016 and gave the province 1 year to redraft legislation in this area. I've spoken with several stakeholders who are disappointed with the government's consultation process on this issue since the court's decision. They said that after initial conversations last fall, they were not consulted until August of this year, 2017, and at that time were only given a few days to provide a formal response to this complex bill. So I'd like to ask the Minister if he's satisfied with the level of consultation undertaken by his department in redrafting the Incompetent Persons Act.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. There's been a number of elements to the consultation process in 2016 and again this past fall. The feedback that we have received has informed the decisions. There are differing opinions and views, Mr. Speaker, in some areas, but we are advancing a piece of legislation that we believe is in the best interest of all Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, in 2010, Canada ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities with the full support of the Government of Nova Scotia. However, Canada has had an ongoing reservation to Article 12 of the Convention, which recognizes equal recognition before the law. This reservation remains in part due to the fact that certain provinces, including Nova Scotia, fail to have an adequate supported decision-making legislation required by Article 12 in place. So I ask the Minister, is he not concerned that the government's attempt to redraft the Incompetent Persons Act will only continue to hinder Canada's ability to meet its international commitment to the UN Convention?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. This is the very area where there are differing opinions and views. We have advanced, Mr. Speaker, a representative decision-making model that has elements of supportive decision-making. We believe, Mr. Speaker, that our work and the bill that we have introduced is compliant with Canada's reservation on the UN Declaration. We believe, Mr. Speaker, that the input that we've received from stakeholders has informed the bill and the piece of legislation. And as my colleague knows, we look forward to further discussions here in the Committee of the Whole. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. In late August, my office received a call from a mother who had found out that her 2 young daughters were not eligible to take the bus to school. So they would have to walk 47 minutes to their junior high, crossing Portland Street, one of the busiest streets in our province. There is a bus that picks up students outside this woman's house for the elementary school that shares a property with the junior high, but her daughters aren't allowed on it. She has contacted the school board, and Stock Transportation and has received no response. My question is, will the minister commit to ensuring rules around busing are flexible so that all students can safely get to school?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Of course, the health and safety of our children, getting them to and from school safely, is paramount for all partners in the education system. I'd be happy to receive more information on the specific case, because if indeed there are safety concerns that are being expressed by parents, they do need to be properly addressed by the school board. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the Minister's response. Since the beginning of the school year, my office has received a number of calls about busing. I have a situation in my constituency at an elementary school where a bus has gotten students to school late every day this year, bus routes being changed or cancelled mid-year with no explanation. The list goes on, Mr. Speaker. When parents try contacting Stock Transportation, often they receive no answer. My question for the minister is, what is this government doing to ensure Stock Transportation is properly fulfilling the requirements of its contract and getting students to school safe and on time? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, if there are specific cases that do need investigation, we're happy to do that. It is appropriate for parents to reach out to school boards directly if they are having challenges in terms of getting responses. That is something that the department can help them with. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Health. In the annual accountability report on emergency departments for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2016, the Roseway Hospital in Shelburne was closed for 1,330 hours. That's 55 days. Last weekend, the Roseway Hospital was closed the entire weekend, a total of 50 hours for just one weekend. My question to the Minister is, can the Minister of Health please explain why the people of Shelburne can't rely on their local emergency room to be open?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. I believe we've talked about this in the past, Mr. Speaker. I've been to the Roseway facility, Mr. Speaker. I've had the opportunity to speak to staff there and to tour the facility. One of the things information that I came away from was recognizing that although the community has more physicians than they've had in really in many years, Mr. Speaker, it is about the way that these physicians are choosing to practice, that those physicians in the community are not as interested in working the emergency shifts in the emergency department, Mr. Speaker. That means we rely on other forms of staffing, including locums, Mr. Speaker, and sometimes, especially over long weekends, it becomes more difficult to staff in communities like this, and that would be the situation taking place at Roseway right now.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his response, but sadly we've been talking about this since I've been in the House now. Yesterday, I checked the Nova Scotia Health Authority physician recruitment site to find that Shelburne needed a full-time family physician for the Shelburne Collaborative Family Practice. The ad says the physician will be expected to provide office-based comprehensive primary care as well as inpatient care at the Roseway Hospital and be open to providing long-term care facility coverage as required. Emergency room coverage would be a great benefit to the community, but not essential, and I'll table that document. My question to the Minister is, can the Minister please tell this House, and most importantly, the people in Shelburne County, why emergency room coverage at the Roseway Hospital is not a priority when we're recruiting a new physician to the Shelburne area? And in the words of a former predecessor, to be continued.
The Honourable Member, the Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I think the members here appreciated the throwback to your predecessor. Give him our best if you see him in your community there. Mr. Speaker, again, providing care throughout our healthcare system to all Nova Scotians is indeed a priority, Mr. Speaker. We know that when you look at the calls that come into our emergency departments, often what we're seeing, Mr. Speaker, is that many of the demands there, and we've had conversations about this through estimates at times as well, that really people are going to the emergency rooms because of the primary care needs that they have. That's why we're really focused on improving our primary care access and services, Mr. Speaker, that provides, and the supports that people in communities are most in need of. And I want to remind the member that there is emergency services across the province that are still available.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. We all know how difficult it is when you don't have a family doctor, but I had a call from the family member of a constituent who is now about to lose their family doctor, and that doctor has a practice of approximately 2,000 people. And this person was told that their charge for getting a copy of their record was going to be $100. It didn't matter whether it was 1 page or 100 pages. It was a flat rate of $100. So I did the math. That's 2,000 times $100 is a lot of money that these people can't afford. So where there's no place to store the records once a doctor leaves, my question to the Minister of Health is, would he agree to cover the cost of those copying the medical records for those who don't have a family doctor moving forward?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And there's actually rules in place that govern for physicians. Two things, Mr. Speaker. One is, of course, the responsibility for maintaining the records, even if they retire or move away, that they do have to maintain the records for a period of time for their patients, Mr. Speaker. But in addition, there are rules restricting the amounts that can be charged for providing the service to provide those records to patients. And indeed, I'd like to let the member know that there are aspects of their medical record that are available through the Department of Health as well, not necessarily those records that are on file with the family physician.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am quite aware of the rules around photocopying of records because I've had to do that in my own private practice. But there are those who cannot afford this cost. And so they're having to go without access to their medical records. So when they go to talk to other specialists or other people they're involved with, when they're asked about their medical history, they don't have it. So again, there's nothing stopping the government from paying for the copying of those medical records. There is something stopping the physician from charging too much. But my suggestion, and I'm going to ask it again, is would you commit to paying for the records or giving people a tax credit for those who have to pay for it out of pocket? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a colleague of the member asked a similar question earlier, I'd like to let the member know that indeed one of the motivations of a project that we're pursuing as a province of establishing a one-patient, one-record, that would be an integrated system for the health records for Nova Scotians, which is an investment. It's obviously a very large project to integrate and provide that type of access, but that's the path that we're going down, Mr. Speaker, to address in part this very issue and concern.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Municipal Affairs. Today, CBC highlighted the story of two municipal councillors, Megan Hodges, a King City councillor who found out a few days before she was elected in 2016 that she was pregnant, and Deputy Mayor Emily Lutz, who is pregnant and due in March. Mr. Speaker, when I had my 3 children, I was grateful to have the option to take paid leave. Elected officials in this province currently do not have that option. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of Municipal Affairs agree to amend the Municipal Government Act to ensure that women who are elected to municipal councils have access to paid leave?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for bringing up that very important topic. I had the opportunity this morning to speak to both the councillor and the deputy mayor, and I also want to stand in my place and thank them for bringing this very important issue forward for us to to discuss. I also had the opportunity to speak with the UNSM president this morning. She's very interested in having this conversation in partnership with our department, and that's exactly what we plan to do.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the Minister for the answer. Mr. Speaker, my second question is for the Premier. I am proud to be part of a legislature that is 1/3 women. However, as I mentioned in budget estimates, I'm both happy and slightly depressed that it takes the presence of women in this House to acknowledge the needs of women. Mr. Speaker, it wasn't that long ago when Alexa McDonough was first elected that there were no washrooms for female MLAs in the legislature. Currently, if a member wanted to take maternity leave, they would need to seek permission from the Speaker. Clearly, there are still many barriers to women's full participation in decision-making and political life in this province. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Premier, will he commit to making the changes necessary to ensure that sitting MLAs have access to paid leave?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable for the question. I've had the good fortune at different times seeing young men on this street that I've invited into this house to give them a tour, and I often tell them the story. And Mrs. McDonough came here and there was no washroom for her, and this is important for these young men to understand. This happened in my lifetime, in the lifetime of many of the members in this House, and it's critical that we continue to make sure that our daughters and that our mothers get an opportunity to participate in full participation in all aspects of our society. Speaker, the question brought forward by the honourable member will take under advisement, and we'll move forward to make sure that there are no barriers for anyone to participate in this House.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, a question for the Minister of Agriculture. Mr. Speaker, there is a property on Cheticamp Island, a beautiful property that for years was used by a cooperative of farmers. And Mr. Speaker, there was some agreement with the province, but the agreement, I believe, is in dispute. I would like to know from the Minister if he could indicate, through you, Mr. Speaker, what the province's intention is with that property.
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, I didn't hear the question. If I get him to repeat it.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Speaker, I don't know if I get a third question here, but I think we can get this done in one question. Mr. Speaker, it's a piece of property on Cheticamp Island, and for years it was used by a cooperative of farmers. And they put a lot of effort into the property. They've put up electric fences. They have at least one well on the property. They've had meetings over the years, and it was important for them over the years to have use of the property. I understand that ownership of the property is in dispute. There had been an agreement between the province and the cooperative, and I understand that is in dispute. And I would like to know if the minister could explain what the province's intentions are with that piece of property.
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a very important question. It's one we've been reviewing now for some time. There is a property dispute there between the cooperative and the province. In our view, the property is owned by the province of Nova Scotia. There was never any intention of it ever being owned by anyone else. It's an extremely valuable piece of property. We want to make sure that stays in agricultural land and it doesn't go to development at any time in the future, and we're afraid of that, and we intend to maintain the ownership of that property.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Transportation. Off-highway vehicle enthusiasts in this province have often been approaching the government looking for support in the field of trail connectivity. In other words, you might have a trail that approaches a highway and they have to go down the side of the highway for a certain distance to get on the trail or go into town for some fuel or something. But there was an expectation that a pilot project would be started maybe as early as this fall for 9 or 10 sites around the province to improve trail connectivity. I just wonder if the Minister can update the House on the status of that pilot project and when it can be expected.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for this very important question. The off-highway vehicle pilots will provide an opportunity to promote off-season tourism and to provide connectivity for the trail users in the province. The rules in the pilot will follow the existing rules that are currently in place, which require individuals to have a valid driver's license in addition to an off-highway vehicle license. I want to thank both the Department of Natural Resources and DOTIR for the work that's being done. Recently, we reached out to the OHV folks and indicated to them that we'd be moving forward in the beginning of the new year with rolling out the pilots.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the most recent budget, the government announced 10 new residency positions for DAL for students in Nova Scotia, or so we understood. I think what I've heard, Mr. Speaker, during budget estimates is they still have to go through the SAG-CARMS judgment and passing and so on and so forth. So I want to ask the Minister of Health, is this actually 10 new positions at DAL for students that studied and are from Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I'd mentioned previously, there are the residency positions for family practice, Mr. Speaker. There are specialist residency positions as well. And then on top of that, Mr. Speaker, there are the international practice-ready assessments as well, Mr. Speaker, that were identified. And on top of that, there's the clerkship program for third-year medical students, Mr. Speaker, that we're going through. The member had raised questions, I believe, during estimates. I've committed to documenting in more detail the criteria for those positions, Mr. Speaker, and if the member hasn't received it yet, I'll be, again, just want to make sure he knows that I didn't forget that.
Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired.